Spring 1945. Germany. The war had ended, though for the women standing in the cold processing center, the word liberation meant little. They were German, prisoners of war, and now American guards surrounded them with orders that sent ice through their veins. Strip down. The words echoed against concrete walls. Bare bulbs hung from the ceiling, casting harsh light on faces drained of color. 15 women. 20, perhaps. Greta had stopped counting after the trucks brought them here 3 days ago. Counting felt like preparing, like there was something to prepare for beyond the inevitable. They had heard the stories, whispered in bunkers while bombs fell overhead, passed between trembling lips in bread lines, murmured in the darkness of cellars where families huddled and prayed for morning. What conquering soldiers did to enemy women. What happened when you were alone, vulnerable, at the mercy of men who had every reason to hate you. The radio broadcasts had been clear. The Americans were savages, brutal, without honor or restraint. They would take what they wanted. They always did. Victory gave them that right, didn't it? That was what happened in war. That was what happened when you lost. Greta's hands shook as they reached for the first button of her thin dress. The fabric was already worn, already stained from the journey here. It hardly mattered. Modesty felt like a luxury from another lifetime, from before the bombings, before the surrender, before everything they had believed turned to ash and dust. Around her, other women moved with the same mechanical dread. Frau Dietrich, older, rigid with the effort of maintaining dignity, a girl who might have been 18, tears streaming silently down hollow cheeks. Another woman, her lips moving in prayer that made no sound. Eyes closed, breath caught, hearts hammered against ribs. They waited for the worst. The concrete floor was cold beneath bare feet. The air smelled of disinfectant and fear. Someone was crying. Someone else was perfectly, terribly silent. Greta kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the wall opposite, followed its path from floor to ceiling, memorized its shape, because looking at anything else meant acknowledging where she was. What was about to happen? She had a sister once, younger. Greta didn't know where she was now, didn't know if she was alive. The last letter had come 4 months ago, before the final collapse, before the Allies crossed the Rhine and everything accelerated into chaos and capitulation. She wondered if her sister had faced this moment too, if this was happening everywhere, if this was the price of defeat, paid in flesh and shame, and the systematic destruction of whatever remained after the bombs stopped falling. The door opened. Footsteps approached. Greta's breathing went shallow. Her vision narrowed. This was it. This was the moment. Everything they had been told, everything they had feared, everything that happened to women on the losing side of history. But what happened in that room would shatter everything they had been taught to fear. What happened would be worse than cruelty. It would be something they had no words for, no framework to understand. It would be the beginning of learning that everything they knew was wrong. 72 hours earlier, the truck had rattled through destroyed towns under grey April skies. Greta sat on a metal bench welded to the side, her body pressed between other bodies, all of them silent except for the occasional sob that someone tried to muffle. The truck bed was open to the wind. Cold bit through threadbare coats. The smell of diesel mixed with unwashed skin, and the acrid scent of fear that had its own particular odor, sharp, metallic, like blood before it was spilled. No one spoke much during the journey. What was there to say? They had surrendered. The Americans had them now. Everything that came next was already written in stories they had heard since childhood, since before this war, since the last one. They had been told about the Americans. They had been told about occupation. They had been told what soldiers did when they won. Greta remembered the radio broadcasts from the final months, the frantic voice of the announcer describing Allied atrocities, the savage Americans with their bombs and their contempt for European civilization. They would rape, They would pillage. They would show no mercy, because mercy was weakness, and Americans understood only strength and violence. Her mother had hidden what food remained when rumors of the American advance reached their town, not from the Americans, for after. For whatever came next if they survived the initial taking. Her mother had looked at Greta and her sister with eyes that held knowledge passed down through generations of women. Knowledge of what happened in war, what happened to the defeated. The word Vergewaltigung was never spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. Greta had a cousin who disappeared during the chaos of evacuation, just gone, 17 years old, and vanished into the machinery of collapse. No body, no confirmation, just absence where a person used to be. The family didn't discuss it, couldn't discuss it. Some losses were too terrible to name. So when the Americans came to their town and began rounding up women of fighting age for processing, Greta knew. Everyone knew. This was the collection, the sorting, the beginning of payment for a war they had lost so catastrophically that their entire country lay in ruins. The truck had stopped at a facility outside a town whose name she never learned. Barbed wire, watchtowers, guards with rifles and expressions of exhaustion or boredom, or something that might have been pity, but probably wasn't. They were herded into a holding room. Concrete walls, no windows, a single door with an American soldier standing outside. They waited for hours. Some women sat on the floor despite the cold. Others stood. Frau Dietrich maintained perfect posture against one wall, her face a mask of rigid control. The young girl cried until she had no tears left, then sat hollow-eyed and silent. An older woman whose name Greta never learned kept touching a small cross beneath her collar, over and over, a prayer or a talisman, or just something to hold on to while everything else slipped away. Would it be quick? Would they be separated? Would anyone ever know what happened here? Greta's sister was somewhere, maybe alive, maybe facing this same moment in another camp, another processing center, or maybe already gone. Maybe this had already happened to her, and Greta was just catching up to a fate already written. The waiting was its own torture, worse than knowing might have been. The fabric slipped from her shoulders. Cold air touched skin that had not been exposed like this since childhood, since before shame had meaning. Greta turned to face the wall. Others did the same. Some kept their eyes open. Most squeezed them shut, as if darkness could protect them from what was coming. Fingers fumbled with buttons, with the tie at her waist, with undergarments worn thin and grey from washing and rewashing and never being fully clean. The girl beside her was shaking so violently her teeth chattered. The sound echoed in the concrete room like bones rattling. They stood naked in a row, exposed, vulnerable in a way that went beyond physical. This was the moment. This was when it would begin. Greta's heart hammered. Her breath came shallow and quick. She could smell her own fear, could feel it coating her skin like oil. Every muscle tensed, every nerve screamed. The door opened behind them. This was it. But no rough hands grabbed at exposed flesh. No mocking voices called out obscenities. No violence crashed over them like the wave they had braced for. Instead, footsteps, multiple sets, light, almost soft. And then a voice, female, speaking English with authority but not cruelty. Another voice responding, also female. Greta risked opening her eyes, turned her head slightly, saw women in American military uniforms, clean pressed jackets, skirts, hair pinned back with military precision, medical personnel, nurses perhaps, officers. Their faces were tired but professional, clinical. They carried clipboards, wore gloves. One of them spoke in German, accented but clear. Medical examination, standard delousing procedure, for your health and safety. The words made no sense. Where were the men? Why were they speaking softly? Why was no one laughing? Why was no one reaching? Why did their eyes look at bodies with the detachment of doctors rather than the hunger of conquerors? A nurse approached Greta, gestured for her to raise her arms, checked her scalp, her hair, looking for lice. The hands were gloved, impersonal, careful. They moved through the examination with practiced efficiency. No lingering, no leering, just checking, just documenting. Delousing powder was applied, white dust that stung slightly and smelled sharp. A basic health. Screening followed. Questions about injuries, illnesses, any pain, any bleeding. The translator repeated each question in German with the same neutral tone one might use at a normal doctor's visit. They were offered thin blankets between examinations, told to wrap themselves while they waited. Small mercy, but mercy nonetheless. Greta clutched the rough fabric and felt her mind struggling to process what was happening. Or rather, what was not happening. She had expected brutality. She had braced for violation. She had prepared to disappear into whatever women became when the worst occurred. But the hands that touched her were gentle, clinical, almost apologetic in their efficiency. One nurse noticed Greta shivering, the trembling that went beyond cold into something primal and uncontrollable. The nurse left, returned with a second blanket, draped it over Greta's shoulders without comment, then said something in broken German. "Es tut mir leid. I know this is frightening." Greta stared at her, at this American woman in uniform, at this enemy who was supposed to be savage, brutal, without mercy or humanity, this woman who had just apologized for Greta's fear. The room spun slightly. Nothing made sense. They were being treated like people, like human beings who deserved basic dignity, basic care, as if their bodies were not spoils of war, but simply bodies. Tired and dirty and frightened bodies that needed medical attention and nothing more. The confusion was almost worse than terror would have been. Terror at least made sense. After the examination they were given clothing, not their own stained dresses, but American military surplus, trousers that had been altered, shirts too large but clean, jackets with patches removed, used but serviceable. The fabric felt strange against skin. Foreign, like wearing the uniform of the enemy, except it wasn't a uniform anymore. Just clothes. They were led across a compound to a long wooden building. Barracks. Greta expected cells, expected bars and locks and darkness, expected to be caged like animals awaiting slaughter or worse. Instead, there were cots. Thin mattresses, but mattresses nonetheless. A stove in the corner, cold now but functional. Someone could light it. Windows that showed grey sky and bare trees. The windows had no bars. The door closed behind them. A lock turned, but from outside. They were contained but not caged. The distinction felt important, though Greta could not articulate why. For a long moment no one moved. They stood in the center of the room, stunned by the ordinariness of it. This was not a dungeon. This was barely even a prison. This was just a room. Plain and cold and spare, but just a room. Frau Dietrich spoke first. Was haben Sie vor? What are they planning? The question hung in the air. Others gathered close. Voices dropped to whispers, as if the Americans might be listening, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell kept them safe. "It's a trick," someone said. "They lull us, make us comfortable. Then it happens." The young girl who had cried herself empty shook her head. "Why bother? If they wanted to hurt us, they would just do it." "You don't understand Americans," Frau Dietrich said. She had lived through the First War, remembered occupation then. They have their methods, their ways of breaking people. An older woman disagreed quietly. "I knew Americans once, after the last war. Aid workers. They were not cruel. They were not like this." "That was different," Frau Dietrich snapped. "That was before everything." Greta listened, but said nothing. Her mind turned over the possibilities, like stones in a river, smooth and round and impossible to grasp. Nothing fit. The medical examination made no sense. The clothing made no sense. These cots and windows and unlocked space made no sense. They had been told the Americans were savages. They had been certain of brutality. But today, they had been touched only by medical hands, given blankets and clothes and beds, treated with something that looked disturbingly like basic human decency. Could propaganda lie so completely? Could everything they had been taught be false? Or was this truly just the prelude, the softening before the real cruelty began? Trust felt dangerous. Belief felt like the final betrayal, like stepping toward the edge of a cliff in darkness, not knowing if the ground would hold or give way into nothing. Night fell. The room grew darker, colder. No one lit the stove. No one seemed to know if they were allowed. The door remained closed, locked from outside. A guard walked past at intervals. His boots echoed on gravel. But he never entered, never even looked through the window. Greta lay on her cot, fully clothed, watched the door, waited. Her body would not relax, could not. Every footstep outside brought fresh tension. Every sound was the beginning of what they had been promised would happen. But the night passed. Hours of darkness and waiting and nothing. In the morning, light filtered through the windows, pale and grey, but light. Dawn came and they were still untouched, still whole, still inexplicably safe. The first night passed, then the second, and still no one came. Days turned to weeks. 3 weeks into captivity, and a routine had emerged from the chaos. Morning roll call in the yard, breakfast that was thin but regular, watery porridge, bread that was more sawdust than flour, but food, consistent, expected, then work assignments, kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning the barracks and administrative buildings. The strange normalcy of it made Greta's head spin. Guards nodded curtly as they passed, gave orders firmly but without cruelty. No one shouted, no one struck. The Americans seemed tired more than anything, bored perhaps, ready to go home. The 4th week brought the second gesture. Greta was assigned to kitchen duty, washing pots in water that was never quite hot enough. Her hands were raw and red. The work was monotonous, but it kept her mind occupied. Kept her from thinking too much about the cognitive dissonance that grew sharper each day. She lifted a heavy pot from the drying rack. Her grip slipped. The pot fell, clattered against the concrete floor with a sound like thunder. Greta flinched, dropped to her knees. Every muscle memory from years of war screamed that dropped items meant punishment, meant a hand across the face or worse. She waited for the blow, for the shout, for consequences that would finally match what she had been taught to expect. An American guard approached. Young, maybe 20. He bent down, picked up the pot, examined it for damage, found none, handed it back to her, said nothing, walked away. That was all. Greta stood frozen. The pot trembled in her hands. She waited for him to return, for the delayed punishment, for something, but he was already gone, already moving on to whatever task came next, as if dropping a pot was just dropping a pot, nothing more. The 5th week they were told they could write letters, censored but allowed. Greta sat with a stub of pencil and a single sheet of thin paper, thought about her mother, her sister, whether either was alive to receive anything she might write. She wrote anyway. Ich verstehe es nicht. I don't understand it. She described the barracks, the food, the work, the medical care when the young girl developed a fever, the absence of brutality. She did not use the word kindness because she did not trust it yet. But the facts she listed spoke for themselves. Clean bandages, regular meals, guards who gave orders but did not abuse, treatment that looked disturbingly like basic human decency. She folded the letter, gave it to the translator for processing, wondered if it would ever arrive, wondered if truth could survive the journey when lies had travelled so much faster. Other women began to speak more openly. Frau Dietrich admitted one evening that her daughter's unit had been treated far worse by Soviet forces, that what they experienced here was mild by comparison. The admission cost her something. Pride, perhaps, or certainty. The rigid framework that had held her upright was cracking. Another woman mentioned a guard who brought extra blankets when someone fell ill. Small thing, nothing dramatic, but it happened. It was real. It accumulated. They were given food. They were given work. They were given something that looked impossibly like basic dignity. The 6th week, Greta woke and realized she had slept through the night, had not listened for footsteps, had not watched the door. Her body had decided, without consulting her mind, that perhaps this place was not an immediate threat, that perhaps survival meant more than minute-by-minute vigilance. She caught herself that morning not tensing when a guard walked past. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her hands stayed open rather than clenched into fists. She had expected to die here. Instead, she was living. 6 weeks. Spring settling into something warmer. The women were allowed an hour, outside in a fenced yard behind the barracks. Not freedom, but air, sunlight, grass beneath feet that had forgotten what growing things felt like. Greta sat with a group near the fence. Others walked the perimeter. Some just stood with faces turned toward the sun like flowers seeking light. The translator approached. Corporal Schmidt, German-born but American-raised. She had told them this weeks ago. Her family had left in the 20s, before everything collapsed into what it became. She wore her American uniform without apparent shame or conflict. Greta envied that certainty. Schmidt sat on the grass near them, spoke in German that carried the peculiar accent of someone who learned the language as a child, then left it behind. "I've been given permission to answer questions, if you have any." The women exchanged glances. This felt dangerous. Questions meant engaging, meant treating the enemy as a person rather than a force. But curiosity was stronger than caution after 6 weeks of confusion. Frau Dietrich asked first, "Where is Hitler? Dead." Schmidt's voice was matter-of-fact. Suicide in Berlin before the Soviets arrived. Some women nodded. Others looked skeptical. Propaganda had prepared them for lies, for deception. How did anyone know what was true anymore? "What happens to us now?" someone else asked. "Processing. Eventually you'll be released, sent to displaced persons camps, then home if there's home to return to." The words carried weight. Home. What did that mean now? What remained of the places they had come from? Greta found her voice. The question had been building for weeks. Why don't you hate us? The vulnerability of asking. The admission embedded in the question. That she expected hatred. That hatred would have made sense. That kindness was the thing she could not reconcile. Schmidt was quiet for a moment. Looked at her hands. Some do. Many lost people they loved. Brothers, friends, fathers. But hate is exhausting. And you're not the ones who made the decisions. You're just... She searched for words. You're just the ones left behind. The simplicity of it. The reduction of everything complex into something almost unbearably human. One of the younger women spoke. Her voice was barely audible. "What about the camps, the concentration camps? What's true?" Schmidt's face changed. This was different territory. Dangerous in ways the previous questions were not. "What you heard is true. Worse than true. Worse than propaganda claimed." The words landed like stones. Several women shook their heads, refused to hear it. That was Allied lies, exaggeration, impossible. "I've seen the photographs," Schmidt said quietly. "I've talked to soldiers who liberated them. It's worse than you can imagine." Greta felt something crack inside her chest. She wanted to deny it, wanted to say Schmidt was lying or mistaken or showing them false evidence. But Schmidt's face held no triumph, no satisfaction in delivering this truth, only sorrow. The group fractured. Some women stood and walked away, refused to listen. Others sat with expressions of dawning horror. The young girl who cried began crying again. Frau Dietrich looked older suddenly, diminished. Greta sat with two truths that could not coexist but did. Her country had committed atrocities beyond comprehension, And these Americans were treating her with unexpected humanity. Both were true. Both were real. They had been told the Allies were savages, monsters without conscience or restraint. But if Schmidt spoke truth, then who were the savages? 2 months. Early summer brought heat that made the barracks stifling at night. The young girl who cried developed fever, pain in her abdomen that grew sharper, more urgent. By morning, she could not stand. The Americans rushed her to the base hospital, not a field tent, not a makeshift clinic, the same facility where their own wounded were treated. Greta was sent along because she had nursing experience from the war, years of rolling bandages and holding down screaming men while doctors worked. The Americans seemed to think this qualified her to help. She expected a separate ward, expected the girl to be treated as lesser, as enemy, as expendable. Instead, she watched the same doctors who treated American soldiers examine the German girl with the same focused attention. Appendicitis. Surgery required immediately. The doctor explained the procedure to Greta in simple English, while Schmidt translated, told her the girl would survive if they operated now. They wheeled her into surgery. Greta waited in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and blood, and the peculiar metallic scent of fear that permeated all medical facilities. Around her, American wounded lay in beds, missing limbs, bandaged heads, the debris of war waiting to heal or die. A soldier in a bed near where she sat watched her. Young, maybe 22. His leg was wrapped in bandages, healing from something. He saw her POW designation, the markings that identified her as German, as enemy. After a long silence, he spoke. Schmidt materialized to translate, though Greta had not seen her approach. "Where are you from?" "A town near Frankfurt." The words felt strange. Admitting geography, admitting she came from somewhere specific, rather than just being generic enemy. "My grandfather came from Germany." The soldier's voice was tired. Not hostile, just tired. Been wanting to see it. Different circumstances would have been better. Silence stretched between them. "I'm glad the war is over." He said it simply, like stating a fact about weather, like commenting on something mundane rather than the end of everything. Greta nodded, could not speak. Her throat was too tight. He did not curse her, did not rage, did not blame her for his missing friends or his wounded leg or the years stolen from his youth. He just lay there, exhausted, ready to go home, human in a way she had been taught Americans could not be. The girl survived surgery, woke in a clean bed with the same post-operative care given to everyone. Greta sat with her while she slept off the anesthesia, watched nurses check her vitals with the same attention they gave their own. Later, Greta found herself alone in a storage room, finally let herself cry, not from fear, from the weight of being so completely wrong, about everything. The Americans were not angels. She had seen them frustrated, exhausted, short-tempered with each other. But they were not monsters. They were just people, tired people who wanted to go home. That night she wrote in the small notebook she had been keeping, "Ich schäme mich. I am ashamed, not for losing the war, for believing we had to win it to survive what came after." 2 months ago she had stood naked in terror. Now she sat clothed in shame, but also in something that might eventually become understanding. 3 months. Summer settled over the camp, with heat that shimmered off concrete. The women awaited final processing, release, repatriation, words that meant return, but to what remained uncertain. Greta moved through daily routines without the rigid tension that had defined her first weeks, walked past guards and exchanged simple greetings. "Guten Morgen," "Good morning." The words were automatic now, unremarkable. She no longer flinched when footsteps approached, no longer calculated escape routes that did not exist. Her body had accepted what her mind still struggled to fully process. The group of women had reached an unspoken consensus. What they were told was wrong. Not in every detail. War was still brutal, People still suffered. Cities still lay in ruins. But the fundamental lie had been exposed, that Americans would destroy them, that mercy was weakness and cruelty was strength, that the enemy was inhuman. The lie had been complete, and they had believed it completely. Evening brought cooler air. Greta sat outside with Frau Dietrich. The older woman had softened over the months. The rigid posture had loosened. The mask had cracked enough to show the exhausted human beneath. I taught my children to fear the Americans more than the Soviets. Frau Dietrich's voice was quiet, almost confessional. I was wrong. 3 words, simple, devastating in their honesty. Greta understood what those words cost. The framework that had held Frau Dietrich upright was gone. Certainty had been the last thing she possessed. Now even that was stripped away. We were all wrong, Greta said. They sat in silence as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Around them, other women talked quietly, mended clothes, wrote letters, lived in the small ways people lived even in the wreckage of everything they knew. Greta's mind turned over the transformation, tried to name it. The worst thing they did to us was be kind. The thought crystallized, became clear, because kindness cannot be argued with, cannot be dismissed, cannot be rationalized away. Kindness forced us to see our enemy as human, which meant confronting that we had been taught to be inhuman. The revelation sat heavy in her chest. Schmidt approached the next day, told them processing was nearly complete. Within the week, they would be transferred to displaced persons camps. From there, hopefully home. Whatever home meant now. One of the women had been embroidering during the long, empty hours, flowers on a handkerchief using thread pulled from old clothes. She gave it to Schmidt without ceremony, just held it out. A gift, an acknowledgement, something. Schmidt's eyes filled. Ich werde es behalten. I will keep it. The exchange was small, nothing dramatic, but it carried weight that made Greta's throat tighten. This American woman, this enemy, this person who had shown them unexpected patience. Thank you, Schmidt said. In English first, then German. Danke. For what? The woman who made the handkerchief seemed genuinely confused. For trusting us enough to change your mind. Greta lay in her cot that night, listened to the familiar sounds of women breathing in darkness. She had arrived expecting death, had stood naked in terror, waiting for brutality that never came. She was leaving, having learned something more difficult than survival, that everything she knew was wrong, that the enemy was human, that propaganda had taught her to fear the wrong things. Late summer 1945. Greta returned to what remained of her hometown, rubble-lined streets that used to have names. Buildings stood gutted, blackened, hollow-eyed and skeletal against grey sky. Survivors moved through the wreckage like ghosts, thin, exhausted, scavenging for anything useful in the bones of what used to be. She found her mother alive, her younger brother alive. Their home was destroyed, but they had found shelter in a cellar 2 streets over. The reunion was overwhelming, relief so sharp it hurt. They had survived the war, survived the occupation. Now they had to survive the peace. Within days, neighbors came asking questions. Other survivors, women who had hidden, men who had returned from other fronts. They wanted to know what American captivity was like. Hunger for validation burned in their eyes. They wanted stories of cruelty, needed them perhaps, to explain Soviet brutality in the East, to make sense of their losses. Greta tried to tell the truth. They were not what we were told. The words landed wrong, created confusion, sometimes anger. "You were lucky," one woman spat. "The Soviets took my daughter. She was 14. What the Soviets did." Greta knew. Everyone knew. The stories from the Eastern occupation were horror upon horror. Women brutalized, children murdered, villages erased. The Red Army's revenge had been systematic and savage. But that truth did not erase her truth. "I'm sorry," Greta said. "I'm so sorry, but what I experienced was different." The woman walked away. Others looked at Greta with suspicion, as if her lack of suffering was betrayal, as if kindness from Americans somehow diminished Soviet atrocity or made German guilt less real. She stopped trying to explain. The isolation was profound. She had been transformed, but could not communicate the transformation. The people around her needed Americans to be monsters because it was simpler, because it fit the narrative, because acknowledging American humanity meant acknowledging German inhumanity more starkly. She wrote a letter one evening, addressed it to Corporal Schmidt at the American base, had no idea if it would arrive, wrote anyway. "You showed us kindness when cruelty was expected. This was harder to bear than brutality would have been. Cruelty I was prepared for. Kindness demanded I change everything I thought I knew. I do not know if I can thank you for this, but I wanted you to know it mattered, that it changed me, that I will carry this forward, even though I do not yet know how." She never sent it, kept it folded in her pocket, a document of transformation that had no audience. Her mother asked one night what happened in the camp. Really happened. "They treated us like people," Greta said simply. Her mother nodded, did not press. Perhaps she understood that some truths were too complex for easy telling. That transformation was personal and isolating, and could not be shared like bread. Greta had survived 2 wars, the one with guns and bombs and cities burning, and the one in her mind between what she was taught and what she lived. The second war had no armistice, no clear ending, just the slow, painful work of rebuilding belief from rubble. Months after liberation, she was still learning what it meant to be free, 40 years after the war's end. An old woman sat in a modest apartment in West Germany. Outside the window, Frankfurt had been rebuilt. Modern, prosperous, part of Europe rather than its wound. Greta was in her 70s now. Her granddaughter Anna visited on Saturdays, brought groceries, stayed for tea, asked questions about the war because she was studying history at university, because the past mattered even when it was painful. Today, Anna found the old diary while looking for photographs, small notebook with water-stained pages, faded ink, German script from another era. "What is this?" Greta took it carefully, held it like something fragile. "My diary from 1945, from the American camp." Anna's eyes widened. "Can I read it?" Greta nodded, watched her granddaughter's face as she read, saw confusion, surprise, the cognitive dissonance that Greta herself had lived 40 years ago playing out again in this young face. "You were afraid they would hurt you." "Yes, but they didn't." "No." Anna looked up. "I don't understand. We learned in school about occupation, about how hard it was. But this sounds almost decent," Greta finished. It was, in ways I had no framework to understand. She told Anna about the medical examination, the clothing, the food, the young soldier in the hospital who spoke about his German grandfather, the accumulation of small mercies that shattered everything she had been taught. They stripped us bare, not of our clothes, of our certainties. And perhaps that was the most thorough conquering of all. Anna was quiet, processing. Greta went to a drawer, pulled out a letter, yellowed with age, carefully preserved. 30 years after the war this arrived, forwarded through military channels, from Corporal Schmidt. The letter was brief. Schmidt had kept the embroidered handkerchief, treasured it, thought of those women often, hoped they were well, hoped they had found peace. "She remembered us," Greta said softly. "What did you learn?" Anna asked. "From all of it?" Greta looked out the window at the rebuilt city, at the peace that had held for 40 years, at a Germany integrated into Europe, at grandchildren who would never know what she knew. We were taught that strength was hardness, that mercy was weakness, that the only way to survive defeat was through the brutality of the victor. But they showed us something else, that the truly strong can afford to be kind, that humanity survives not when we dehumanize our enemies, but when we refuse to, even when we have won the right to. She held the diary, the letter, artifacts of transformation. I raised your mother differently, taught her that enemies are human, that propaganda must be questioned, that kindness is powerful precisely because it cannot be argued away. The shock was not in what they did, but in the absence of what we feared they would do. And in that absence a space opened, a space where a different kind of future could grow.